denoted as L25, entitled Protection of the Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. We seek to place this resolution under the 10th Emergency Special Sessions Agenda, Item 5, which pertains to illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. In light of the gravity of the situation, we also propose a vital procedural step. We call for the suspension of the ongoing debate to occur promptly at 3 p.m. Following this suspension, we aim to initiate immediate action on the draft resolution. Our intention is to then resume the debate immediately after the resolution's adoption, if indeed it is adopted. And it's essential to emphasize that in the event of the adoption, ES10 would only be temporarily adjourned immediately following the conclusion of the debate. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan. The representative of Jordan has moved that the debate on agenda item 5 be suspended at 3 p.m. today for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution A/ES10/L25, and that the debate would continue after the action on the draft resolution. It is my understanding that, without setting a precedence, and given the urgency of the issue, if the Assembly were to decide to suspend the debate on agenda item 3, at 3 p.m., for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution A/ES10/L25, and to continue the debate after the action on draft resolution, and if the Assembly were to adopt the draft resolution later today, that the 10th emergency special session would be adjourned temporarily following the conclusion of the debate on item 5. Is there any objection to the motion? It is so decided. Before proceeding further, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES10/L25 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES10/L25. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore also required for the adoption of any amendment to the draft resolution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Presidente, la República Bolivariana de Venezuela tiene el honor de hacer uso de la palabra en nombre del Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Señor Presidente, los Estados miembros de nuestro Grupo de Amigos han seguido con preocupación los últimos desarrollos en la región del Medio Oriente, en particular el dramático deterioro de la situación en la Franja de Gaza, así como en el resto del territorio palestino ocupado. En ese contexto, contexto, permítanos desde el inicio de nuestra intervención expresar nuestras condolencias a las familias y seres queridos de todos los civiles inocentes que han perdido la vida en el transcurso de estos últimos 20 días a lo largo de esta última y lamentable espiral de violencia, muerte y destrucción. Asimismo, como naciones amantes de la paz que somos y que acatamos estrictamente las normas del derecho internacional, condenamos en los términos más enérgicos todo acto de violencia y cualquier hostilidad dirigida contra civiles. A este respecto, y a la luz del continuo deterioro de la situación sobre el terreno, incluyendo como resultado de la persistencia de bombardeos y ataques aéreos, subrayamos la urgencia de proteger a los civiles y de evitar una mayor pérdida de vidas humanas, en particular a través del fin inmediato de los ataques indiscriminados en curso contra civiles, y garantizando además que la ayuda humanitaria llegue a la población civil necesitada en estos momentos tan difíciles. Enfatizamos que el derecho internacional humanitario debe respetarse y cumplirse a rajatabla. En consecuencia, exigimos urgentemente un alto al fuego y el cese inmediato de todos los actos de violencia y de las hostilidades, en particular de los ataques dirigidos contra civiles, incluidas mujeres, niñas y niños, y contra bienes e infraestructuras civiles, incluyendo, entre otros,
including,
hospitales,
among others,
escuelas,
hospitals, schools,
refugios y
refugee
almacenes de
shelters,
alimentos.
and food warehouses.
En vísperas del 75
On the eve of
aniversario
the
de la Declaración
75th
Universal de los
anniversary of the
Derechos Humanos,
Universal Declaration of
hacemos un
Human Rights,
llamado
we
al
call
pleno
for
respeto
the
de
full
todos
respect of
los
all
derechos
human
humanos,
rights,
en particular del
particularly
derecho a la
the
vida
right
y
to
a la
life
salud.
and health.
Hacemos igualmente un llamado
We also
a la
call for
moderación
restraint,
y en ese orden
and thus
instamos a que se
urge
ponga
an
fin
end
a
to
toda
all
retórica
inflammatory
incendiaria
rhetoric
y a todo lenguaje
and
deshumanizador,
dehumanizing language,
algo que de ninguna manera
which in no
coadyuva
way
a los esfuerzos políticos y
serves
diplomáticos en
ongoing
curso
political and
para
diplomatic
distender la
efforts to
situación sobre el terreno,
de-escalate the situation
y
on the
por el
ground,
contrario,
and
solo
quite to the
avivan
contrary,
aún más
only
las
further
tensiones y
stokes
la violencia,
tensions and
al
violence,
tiempo que ponen
while
en aún
further
más peligro
endangering
la vida de
human
miles de personas inocentes.
thousands of human
Señor presidente,
lives, innocent
en línea
lives.
con el
Mr. President,
comunicado
in line with
especial
a special
emitido por nuestro
communique
grupo de amigos
issued
el
by our
pasado
group of friends
17 de
on
octubre,
17th of October,
aprovechamos esta
we'd
oportunidad
like to seize this
para
opportunity
renovar
to
nuestro
renew
llamado
our
a los
call
miembros responsables
on
de la
responsible
comunidad
members of the
internacional,
international
en
community,
particular a aquellos
particularly
que puedan
those who
tener
may have
influencia,
influence,
así como al Consejo de
as well as
Seguridad
the
de las
Security
Naciones
Council
Unidas,
of the United
en
Nations,
cumplimiento de su deber
in
de mantener
pursuance
la
of its
paz
duty
y
to
la
maintain
seguridad
international
internacional,
peace and security,
tal y como se establece en la
as
Carta de las
provided for
Naciones
in the
Unidas,
Charter of the United
para que
Nations,
inste
to
a
urge Israel
a que ceda a los llamados
to
del
heed
secretario general
the
de las
latest
Naciones
calls of the
Unidas,
Secretary General
a
of the
que
United
adopte el
Nations,
camino de la
to take the
legalidad
path of
internacional,
international legality,
garantizando el pleno
including by ensuring
cumplimiento y su
full
adhesión, entre
compliance and
otros,
adherence
a los propósitos y principios
others,
consagrados en la
to
Carta
the
de las
purposes
Naciones
and
Unidas,
principles enshrined
a
in the
los
Charter
convenios
of the
de
United
Ginebra,
Nations,
incluyendo
the
a sus
Geneva
protocolos
Conventions,
adicionales, así
including
como
its
a todas las
additional
demás disposiciones
protocol,
pertinentes
and all
del
other
derecho
relevant
internacional
provisions of
humanitario
international
y del
humanitarian
derecho
law
internacional
and
de los derechos
international human
humanos.
rights law.
Lo llamamos a que ponga fin de inmediato
call
a la
on Israel
agresión
to put
militar
an
en
immediate
curso
end to the
y al
ongoing
inhumano
military
asedio
aggression
de la
and the
Franja de
inhumane
Gaza,
siege of the
con el
Gaza
fin de
Strip,
evitar una
in order to
catástrofe
avoid a
mayor,
catastrophe
así como el
and
colapso
the
total
total
de las
collapse of
infraestructuras
critical
críticas,
infrastructure,
lo que
which will
inevitablemente
inevitably
provocará más
lead
víctimas
to
civiles,
more civilian
hambre
casualties,
generalizada,
widespread hunger,
enfermedades,
disease,
pobreza y un
poverty,
sufrimiento humano
and even
y una
greater human suffering
desesperación
and
aún
despair,
mayores, empeorando así
thus further
la ya de por sí
deepening
grave
the
crisis
already
humanitaria en
dire
Gaza.
humanitarian crisis in
Hacemos un
Gaza.
llamado a Israel
We
a que
call on Israel to
garantice el
ensure the
acceso y la
rapid
distribución
and
rápida y sin
unhindered
trabas
access and
de la
distribution
ayuda
of
humanitaria
desperately
que se
needed
necesita hoy
humanitarian
desesperadamente
assistance,
sobre el terreno, incluyendo
including
suministros cruciales
crucial
para salvar vidas
life-saving
como combustible,
supplies such as fuel,
alimentos,
food,
medicinas y
medicines, and
agua.
water.
Le hacemos un llamado a
We
que
call on
permita al
Israel to
Organismo de Obras
allow
Públicas y Socorro de las Naciones
UNRWA
Unidas para los refugiados
to
de
operate
Palestina en el cercano oriente
safely
operar con seguridad
and
y
effectively
eficacia, sin
without
obstrucciones,
obstructions,
junto a otros actores
alongside
humanitarios
other
desplegados sobre el
humanitarian actors on the
terreno,
ground,
y a que ponga fin
and to
a los
cease
ataques
attacks
contra el
on
personal de la ONU,
UN and other
así como contra
humanitarian
cualquier
and
otro personal
medical
humanitario y médico.
personnel,
Y por último,
And lastly,
a que derogue de manera inmediata
call on Israel to
su orden
immediately
de que la
abrogate
población
its
civil
order for the civilian
evacúe
population to
todas las zonas del
evacuate
norte
all
de
areas
Gaza,
in northern
así
Gaza,
como cualquier otra medida
as
dirigida
well
al traslado
as any other
forzoso
measure
o al
aimed at the
desplazamiento
forced
masivo
transfer
de la
or mass
población civil de
displacement of the
Gaza.
civilian population in
Señor
Gaza.
presidente,
Mr. President,
nuestro grupo de amigos
our group
lamenta
of friends
que el Consejo de
regrets that the
Seguridad de las
Security
Naciones
Council of the
Unidas
United Nations
se haya visto
has been
impedido de
prevented
ejercer sus
from
funciones
exercising
en lo
its
que respecta
duties
a
with
garantizar
regards
el
to the
mantenimiento
maintenance
de
of
la paz
international
y la
peace and
seguridad
security,
internacionales, a pesar de los llamados
despite the
reiterados
repeated
y
and collective
colectivos,
call
tanto del Grupo Árabe
of
como de la
both
comunidad
the Arab group
internacional en
and the
general,
international community
para
as
que
a
ese
whole, for
órgano
it to
exigiera un cese al
demand
fuego,
a comprehensive
la protección de
ceasefire,
civiles,
the protection of
así como
civilians,
equidad y
as well as
justicia
fairness
en el
and
abordaje
justice
de tan grave
in
situación.
dealing with this dire
Confiamos, sin
situation.
embargo,
We
en
trust,
que esta Asamblea
however,
General
that this
cumplirá
General Assembly will
inequívocamente sus
unequivocally fulfill its
responsabilidades en virtud de la
responsibilities
Carta de las Naciones
under
Unidas,
the Charter of the United Nations,
incluyendo a
including by
través de la adopción de
adopting
medidas
relevant
pertinentes
measures
encaminadas
aimed
a
at
abordar la situación actual,
redressing the current
en
situation,
particular con el fin de
particularly
garantizar la protección de todos
aimed
los
at ensuring
civiles
the
y
protection
el
of all
respeto
civilians
de
and the
obligaciones
respect
jurídicas, incluidas
for
aquellas
other
derivadas
legal
del derecho
obligations,
internacional
including those
humanitario.
derived from
En
international
ese contexto
humanitarian law.
expresamos nuestro firme
We
apoyo al
express in this
proyecto de
context our
resolución
strong support to
L.25
draft resolution
presentado por la delegación de Jordania en su calidad de presidente del
25
Grupo
submitted by
Árabe,
the delegation
al
of
tiempo
Jordan as
que
chair of the Arab
instamos
group
a
and
todos los
urge
miembros
all
responsables de la
responsible
comunidad
members of the
internacional
international
a
community
que apoyen
to support
decididamente ese texto.
text strongly.
Además, aprovechamos
Moreover,
esta oportunidad para
we'd like to
reiterar una
seize
vez
this
más nuestro
opportunity to
llamado
once
a
again
favor de la liberación de
call
todos los
for the release
civiles,
of all
así
civilians,
como de los presos y
as well as
detenidos
Palestinian prisoners
palestinos,
and
incluidas
detainees,
niñas y
including
niños,
children,
así como a
and for
favor
the
de la adopción de
adoption
medidas
of
urgentes
urgent
destinadas a
measures
garantizar,
aimed at ensuring,
por
on
un
one
lado,
hand, the safety
la seguridad
and
y el
well-being
bienestar
of all
de todos los
civilians,
civiles, y por otro,
and on the other,
la prestación de
the
protección
provision of
internacional a
international
la población
protection
civil
for the
palestina
Palestinian
en el
civilian
territorio palestino
population
ocupado,
in the occupied
incluida
Palestinian
Jerusalén
territory,
Oriental,
including East Jerusalem,
incluso sobre la
including
base
on the
de las
basis of the
recomendaciones formuladas
recommendations
por el
made
propio
by the
secretario
Secretary
general
General of the United
en su
Nations
informe de
in his
2018,
report from
así como de las
2018,
disposiciones de la resolución
as well as
904
of the
del
provisions
Consejo de
of Security
Seguridad.
Council 904.
En este orden, expresamos también
Similarly,
nuestra
we also
grave
express our
preocupación
grave
por la
concern
escalada
about
de
the
la
escalating
violencia
violence and
y los
attacks
persistentes ataques contra la
against the
población civil
Palestinian
palestina en la
civilian
ribera
population in the
occidental,
West Bank,
incluyendo
including
en
East
Jerusalén
Jerusalem.
Oriental. Exigimos
We
el fin de
demand
la
a
violencia
halt to the
sistémica,
systematic
el
violence,
fin de las
human
violaciones de
rights
los derechos
violations,
humanos, el fin de las
provocations,
provocaciones y de toda incitación,
incitement,
así como de todas
as well
las
as to
actividades de
all
asentamiento
settlement
y las medidas de
activities and
anexión,
annexation
y el
measures,
fin de
and to
todas las
all
demás
other
violaciones del
breaches of the
histórico
historic
status
and
quo
legal
ilegal
status quo
en
of
los
the
lugares sagrados de
sites
Jerusalén.
in Jerusalem.
Es necesario
These
poner
grave
fin a
violations
estas graves
must
violaciones y en este
And
momento
at this stage,
no podemos dejar de
we
insistir
cannot
en que debe
overemphasize
convertirse
that
esto en una prioridad,
further
impedir que se
that
siga
this should be a
desestabilizando
top priority,
peligrosamente la
that
situación,
any further
todo
dangerous
esto incluso como
destabilization
parte
of
de
the
los esfuerzos en
situation must be
curso
prevented,
para
including as
evitar
part
la
of efforts to
propagación del
prevent a
conflicto
spillover
a toda la
effect
región del
into the
Oriente
entire
Medio.
Middle East region.
Señor Presidente,
Mr.
en
President,
plena correspondencia
in line
con
with our
nuestras
principled
posiciones
and
históricas y
historic
de
position,
principios, reafirmamos
we
nuestro firme
reaffirm
compromiso
our
con la causa de
commitment to the cause
Palestina,
of Palestine,
miembro de nuestro
a
grupo de
fellow member
amigos,
from our group
en su
of friends
justa y
and its
legítima lucha por
people in their
lograr sus
just and
derechos
legitimate struggle
inalienables,
to achieve their
incluyendo a la
inalienable rights,
autodeterminación,
including
la
the
libertad,
self-determination,
el
freedom,
retorno de los
the
refugiados de
return of
Palestina y la
Palestinian
justicia.
refugees and justice.
Destacamos en este
We
contexto
emphasize
la
in this context the
importancia, como
importance
nunca
as never
antes,
before
de crear
of
un
creating
horizonte
a
político
credible
creíble
political
para la
horizon
realización
for the
de una solución
realization
justa
of
y
a just and
duradera a la
lasting
cuestión de
solution
Palestina
to the
en
question
todos
of
sus
Palestine
aspectos,
in all its aspects,
incluida la difícil
including
situación de los
for
refugiados de
the
Palestina,
plight of the
en estricto
Palestinian
apego a las normas del
refugees
derecho
in full accordance with
internacional, a las
international
resoluciones
law,
pertinentes
the
de las
relevant
Naciones
UN
Unidas
resolutions,
y a la Carta
and the
Fundacional de
Charter
nuestra
of the
organización.
United Nations.
Subrayamos además
stress
la
furthermore
urgencia
the
de
urgency
avanzar
of
nuestros esfuerzos en ese sentido,
efforts in this
los cuales deben
regard,
estar
and
encaminados,
they
entre
should be
otros,
aimed at
a hacer realidad el abrumador consenso
and,
internacional sobre la solución de dos estados en las fronteras previas a 1967. Asimismo, enfatizamos que una solución duradera al conflicto israelí-palestino solo puede lograrse por medios pacíficos. De allí que hagamos un llamado a que se realicen esfuerzos urgentes para abordar las causas estructurales de este prolongado y trágico conflicto, así como para garantizar la rendición de cuentas y para promover y apoyar esfuerzos significativos destinados al logro de una solución justa, duradera e integral. Por último, concluimos reafirmando nuestro pleno compromiso de preservar, promover y defender la prevalencia y vigencia de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, un tratado histórico que constituye un verdadero acto de fe en lo mejor de la humanidad y que, aunque actualmente bajo ataque y persistentes amenazas, nos mantiene a todos obligados, entre otras cosas, a honrar nuestra promesa de salvar a las generaciones venideras del flagelo de la guerra y a garantizar el respeto de la dignidad y el valor de la persona humana. Actuemos pues sin más demoras, de manera colectiva y responsable, para cumplir nuestros deberes y obligaciones en virtud de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
The distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jamaica.
Mr. President, the attacks on Israeli civilians by Hamas on October 7 were abhorrent. They were acts of terror that must never be condoned. Ordinary Israeli citizens, men, women, and children, were murdered, wounded, abducted, and assaulted. Some 200 plus people, including citizens of other states and nationalities, were taken hostage. This is unacceptable. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and an end to the use of these terrorist tactics. CARICOM notes that Israel's response to the attacks has been devastating to ordinary Palestinians in Gaza. Over 4,600 lives have been lost. More than 14,000 people have been wounded, and approximately 1.4 million have been displaced. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is worsening daily, with women and children being disproportionately impacted. This unacceptable level of human suffering cannot go unabated. CARICOM therefore joins the call for an immediate cessation of hostilities by all parties, the opening of humanitarian corridors to facilitate unhindered access to food, medical supplies, fuel, water, and other humanitarian products and services so desperately needed by the affected civilian population. We commend the Secretary General for his relentless efforts in coordinating the delivery of humanitarian assistance and supplies to those affected. We also commend the work of UN staff and affiliated personnel who are working tirelessly to provide support to the affected population. We also acknowledge the role of members of the United Nations that are actively deploying resources and facilitating access to amenities aimed at alleviating the suffering of the civilian population. CARICOM conveys its deepest condolences to the families of Israelis and Palestinians who have lost loved ones. We also empathize with the families of the UN staff members who have been killed. CARICOM also extends its sympathies to those injured during this tragic conflict and pray for their speedy recovery. Mr. President, CARICOM expresses its concern that if the conflict is not immediately brought to an end, it could escalate into a wider regional conflict with significant implications for the stability and welfare, not just of that region, but also of the broader international community, with devastating consequences, especially for vulnerable small island states such as those in CARICOM, who are already struggling to overcome multifaceted challenges. CARICOM therefore calls on all stakeholders to take every necessary step to re-establish a pathway to peace and stability through dialogue and diplomacy, and to reject any methodology that includes violence, war, and terror. The ordinary people of the region, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, all deserve to live in peace and harmony, free from the pernicious threats and constant fear of violence and terror. Let us once and for all acknowledge and accept the utter futility of war, violence, and terror, and recognize that dialogue and diplomacy constitute the only viable pathway to a lasting peace. Mr. President, please allow me to close by reaffirming CARICOM's continued support for UN Security Council Resolution 242 and the ongoing efforts of the United Nations towards a two-state solution, which is the best way to achieve comprehensive peace, security, and tranquility between Israel and Palestine. CARICOM urges the acceleration of these efforts to bring about an urgent, peaceful, and lasting resolution to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Oman, speaking on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council, to take the floor.
سعادة الرئيس،
Mr. President,
أصحاب المعالي والسعادة
Your
الموقرين،
Excellencies,
السيدات والسادة المحترمين،
ladies and gentlemen,
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
may the peace, mercy, and
أدلي
blessings of
بهذا
God be upon
البيان
you.
نيابة عن
I
الدول
deliver
الأعضاء
this statement
في
on
مجلس
behalf
التعاون
of the
لدول
member
الخليج
states
العربية،
of the
وهي
Gulf Cooperation
الإمارات
Council,
العربية المتحدة،
namely the United
مملكة
Arab
البحرين،
Emirates, the
المملكة
Kingdom of
العربية
Bahrain,
السعودية،
the Kingdom of Saudi
دولة
Arabia,
قطر،
the State of
دولة
Qatar, the
الكويت،
State of
وبلاد
Kuwait,
سلطنة عمان.
and my country, the Sultanate of Oman.
نجتمع اليوم
We
في
meet
هذه
today
الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة
at this emergency
للأسف
special
في
session,
ضوء عجز مجلس الأمن
unfortunately,
عن
as the
اتخاذ أي
Security
موقف
Council
موحد
has been
على مدى
unable
أيام
for days to take a
إزاء ما
united
يحدث في
stance
الأراضي
on
الفلسطينية
what is
المحتلة وعلى
transpiring in
وجه
the occupied
التحديد في
Palestinian
قطاع غزة،
territories,
وما
especially the
تمارسه
Gaza
قوات
Strip,
الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من عدوان
and on the
بحق
aggression
السكان
by
الأبرياء
Israeli
الآمنين،
occupation forces
والذي هو
against
مبعث
innocent
قلق لنا
civilians.
جميعا
This is a cause for
ويستحق
concern for
الإدانة
us
من قبل
all
المجتمع
and must be
الدولي،
condemned by the
حصار
international community.
وتجويع
A siege,
وعقوبات جماعية
starvation, collective
وقطع
punishment,
بإمدادات المياه
cutting
والكهرباء
off water and electricity
ومنع
supplies,
بوصول أبسط متطلبات المعيشة.
denial of the delivery
تدين
of
دول
the
مجلس
most basic
التعاون
necessities of life.
العنف في قطاع
The
غزة
GCC
وتدعو المجتمع
condemns
الدولي إلى
violence
الوقوف
in the Gaza
بحزم
Strip
ضدها
and calls upon the international
كونها
community
تتعارض مع
to
القانون
stand
الدولي
resolutely
والقانون
against
الدولي
it, as
الإنساني
this violence is inconsistent
وتضرب
with
عرض
international
الحائط
law and international
المبادئ
humanitarian law.
المنصوص
It
عليها
is
في
running
اتفاقية
roughshod
جنيف الرابعة
over the principles of the
لعام
Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949,
1949 التي
which compel
تلزم
Israel,
إسرائيل بصفتها
the
سلطة
occupying
احتلال
power,
بحماية
to
المدنيين وقت
protect
الحرب.
civilians in times of war.
سعادة الرئيس،
Mr. President,
تشير الأمم المتحدة
the United
إلى استشهاد
Nations
أكثر من
indicates
6500
that
مواطن
more
فلسطيني
than
في قطاع غزة حتى الآن،
6,500
بينهم
Palestinian citizens
2300 طفل
in Gaza have been martyred so far, among them 2,300 children and 1,200 women, and a number of international staff working for UNRWA.
ناهيك عن أعداد الجرحى
The number
والمصابين
of the
إصابات
injured and those
بالغة وعددهم
sustaining
يربو على
serious
17,000.
injuries, those are more than
ما يحدث اليوم في
17,000.
قطاع غزة
What is happening today in the Gaza Strip is unacceptable, but it will not deter the Palestinian people from demanding its legitimate, inalienable rights, chief among them the right to self-determination and the right to establish an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Palestinian people decided, just as other peoples that suffered from occupation decided to end occupation. The reality is clear to us all and nothing will change it. Palestine, in the eyes of the international community and according to Security Council resolutions, is occupied land. We are therefore surprised and outraged by those who are applauding or are describing occupation and deem it to be an act of self-defense. Self-defense does not happen on occupied, usurped land. Mr. President, the GCC countries agree with the Secretary General of the United Nations that what's happening today in the Gaza Strip did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people has been subjected to a stifling occupation for 56 years. Its land has been swallowed by illegal settlements. Neither the Palestinian people nor any peace-loving nation of the world would accept the occupation of land by force. The Palestinian people will not accept any option that is not based on ending the occupation, liquidating colonialism, and the exercise by the Palestinian people to its inalienable rights, just as any other people of the world. I would like to stress that the GCC countries have full confidence in the Secretary General of the United Nations. We support his efforts to consolidate the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law. We support his call to stability and security. We express our condolences over the passing of UN staff who became victims of the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. The GCC countries stand with international law, international humanitarian law, and international legitimacy represented by the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the ICJ. We support the Arab Peace Initiative. We support a just and comprehensive peace that lays the foundation for a new chapter of peaceful coexistence and security for all peoples in the Middle East. A peace that ends decades of killing, of violence, persecution and systematic violation. Against the above, the GCC countries calls upon all member states to vote for the draft resolution tabled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and to work on an immediate ceasefire, ensure the urgent delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, including food, water, fuel, and medication without any obstacles, to stop the siege, the Israeli siege on Gaza, and resume supply of electricity and water, and to refrain from any plans to forcibly displace the civilian population. I thank you.
Give the floor. I thank the distinguished representative of Oman, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
السيد الرئيس نشكركم على استئناف عقد الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة لجميع العام وننضم إلى البيان المقدم
align ourselves with the statement delivered on behalf of the Arab Group, the OIC, and the statement on behalf of the GCC member states. Mr. President, we all realize that the resumption of this special emergency session comes at a critical time and context. The deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip as a result of the Israeli attacks against innocent civilians have become catastrophic. They threaten to spiral in a manner that would threaten the security of the region and the world. In this manner, we express deep regret over the failure of the Security Council to undertake its responsibilities in accordance with the Charter. The Council failed to adopt any outcome, neither to adopt a resolution for an immediate ceasefire or a binding resolution regarding the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip. As such, it is important for the General Assembly to undertake its responsibility in safeguarding international peace and security, according to the Charter and its Resolution 377, Roman 5, titled Uniting for Peace. We renew our call for all parties for de-escalation and ultimately working for the full ceasefire, the immediate release of all prisoners, particularly civilians, ensure delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza Strip, opening safe corridors that allow the delivery of humanitarian aid. We reaffirm again our condemnation of all forms of targeting civilians, particularly women and children, our unequivocal rejection of the siege, the full siege imposed by Israel, the occupying power on Gaza Strip that deprives 2.3 million people, half of whom are children, of their basic needs, including water, food, medicine and electricity. This comes at a time when the Israeli bombing has killed more than 6,000 victims in Gaza Strip, including more than 1,700 women and more than 3,000 children. We reaffirm our unequivocal rejection of the policies of collective punishment and the efforts and attempts of forcible displacement of Palestinian people from Gaza Strip and forcing civilians to internally displace or take refuge in neighboring countries, which is a violation of international law. In light of this catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip, and in addition to all the diplomatic and humanitarian and mediation efforts that Qatar is undertaking, we also take pride in adopting and presenting this draft resolution submitted by the Arab group titled Protection of Palestinian Civilian Population. Mr. President, the draft resolution represents the minimum obligations of member states in such circumstances that they should undertake to address the grave repercussions of the situation in Gaza Strip. It addresses a critical vacuum in terms of the situation in Gaza Strip, a vacuum created by the failure of the Security Council to perform its legal and ethical responsibilities. Mr. President, it is very important for the General Assembly, through this draft resolution, provide a legal framework of reference needed for the international response to the situation in Gaza. This should also, the support for this draft resolution should reflect the consensus and unity of the international community towards the fair nature of the Palestinian question, and through the wide support for this draft resolution, send a message of hope to our brothers, our Palestinian brothers, that the General Assembly is united to restore respect for international law, for the Charter. We reaffirm that the only guarantee to achieve sustainable peace in the region is to reach a fair and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question in accordance to the Arab Peace Initiative and the two-state solution that guarantees the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with its capital East Jerusalem, and for the Palestinian people to enjoy their inalienable rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, Qatar continues to contribute to the ongoing diplomatic efforts to find a way out that will stop the bloodshed of our Palestinian brothers and ensure a sustainable political solution in accordance to the well-known terms of reference, and steer the region away from spiraling into chaos and violence. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Egypt to take the floor.
السيد دينيس فرانسيس رئيس الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، السادة الحضور، أتقدم لكم بالشكر للدعوة لعقد هذا الاجتماع الضرورة الطارئة العاشرة للجمعية العامة لبحث الأوضاع المأساوية في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، خاصة بعد تعثر مختلف الجهود المتكررة الرامية لإصدار قرار من مجلس الأمن بشأنها ولأسباب لا تخفى على أحد. سيد الرئيس، ما أيسر أن ندلي ببيان نمطي تضمن التحذير من المخاطر الجسيمة للنزاع الدائم نشجب فيه العدوان الإسرائيلي الغاشم على غزة، ونستعرض وحشية هذا العدوان وانتهاكه لكافة القوانين الدولية والقيم الإنسانية، ونكرر الدعوة لحماية الشعب الفلسطيني وضمان وصول المساعدات الإنسانية إليه. سيد الرئيس، ما أصعب أن نضطر إلى تكرار كل ما تقدم أمام كافة المحافل التي ناقشت الأزمة، وفي مقدمتها قمة القاهرة للسلام التي استضاف خلالها السيد رئيس الجمهورية الكثير من قادة العالم في محاولة للخروج من هذه الأزمة، وبعدها النقاش المفتوح في مجلس الأمن حول الشرق الأوسط أول أمس، وثنائيا مع كافة الأطراف الدولية المؤثرة التي تواصلت مع مصر. رغم اقتناعنا سيد الرئيس أن الحق بين وجلي ولا يحتاج لشرح متكرر أو استفاضة، لو استخدمنا جميعا مكيالا واحدا لا مكيالين، هو مكيال واحد نعرفه جميعا سيد الرئيس، لا لاستهداف المدنيين، لا للإرهاب، لا لخرق القانون الدولي الإنساني، لا لقصف المستشفيات والمراكز الطبية، لا لقتل الأطفال ولا للحصار وقطع الاحتياجات الضرورية للحياة عن البشر، ولا للتهجير القسري وتصفية حقوق البشر، لا للإبادة الجماعية. كل البشر متساوون. لقد اخترنا الخيار الأصعب سيد الرئيس، أن نكرس جهدنا وعملنا للخروج بموقف واضح من الجمعية العامة بشأن ما تشهده الأراضي الفلسطينية من انتهاكات وجرائم، حتى لا نكون شيطانا أخرس سكت عن الحق بحسب المثل العربي البليغ، في وقت تتعانى فيه العديد من الأصوات عن قول الحق للأسف.
where so many are turning a blind
لم يعد
eye to the
الصمت
truth.
خيارا، فقد طفح
Silence is
الكيل
no longer an
على ما يجري
option.
لأهل
Enough is
فلسطين.
enough.
الموقف المطلوب
We can no
سادة
longer
الحضور
bear
سيد
what is
الرئيس واضح
happening to the
ومباشر،
Palestinians.
ولا
The required
يتجاوز
stance is
التأكيد
clear
على
and
أبسط
simple.
القيم
It is no
الإنسانية
more than reaffirming the most
وأبسط
basic human
مبادئ
values,
القانون
the most basic
الدولي
principles of international
وأبسط
law, the
الأعراف
most basic
السياسية
political and
والدبلوماسية في
diplomatic
حالات
norms in
النزاع
armed
المسلح.
conflict.
ولذا نؤكد
In this
على النقاط
context,
التالية.
we would like
أولاً،
to stress the following points.
من البديهي عند تفجر التوتر وجولات التصعيد والنزاع أن تعمل المنظومة الأممية على وقف إطلاق النار. ذلك ليس بانحياز لطرف أو دعما للإرهاب، بل هو لحقن الدماء البريئة والحيلولة دون المزيد من التصعيد، والتأكيد على قدرة الأمم المتحدة على الاطلاع بدورها في صيانة أبسط حق في ميثاق حقوق الإنسان، ألا وهو الحق في الحياة. هذا الحق الذي نسيه المتصدقون بحقوق الإنسان الذين باتوا مع التبريرات التي سمعناها لاستمرار هذه الحرب متواطئين مباشرة في التجاوزات التي نشهدها. وقف إطلاق النار، هل هذا بصعب؟ ثانياً، سياسات الحصار والتجويع والحرمان من الاحتياجات الأساسية غذاء ودواء بما في ذلك الماء. أيها السادة الحضور، لا مكان لها في القرن ال21، فهي تذكرنا بممارسات القرون الوسطى، ومن ثم يتعين أن تصدر الجمعية العامة رسالة واضحة لا لبس فيها بضرورة نفاذ هذه الضروريات إلى قطاع غزة دون قيد أو شرط، إذ إن الحرمان من المساعدات الإنسانية تحت هذه الظروف ما هو إلا حكم بالموت على أهل غزة. مساعدات إنسانية بآلية منظمة ومحكمة تشرف عليها الأمم المتحدة، هل ذلك بصعب؟ ثالثاً، إن أي محاولة لتهجير الشعب الفلسطيني داخل أراضيه أو لدول الجوار
or to neighboring
لثالث مرة في
countries for
تاريخه
the
بدعوى
third time
حمايته
in its
أو بأي
history,
دعوة
citing protection as a
أخرى
reason or any other
يتعين
reason.
مجابهتها
Any such attempts must be
بالحزم كل
confronted
الحزم
resolutely
والتأكيد على
and
رفضنا
rejected
القاطع لها.
categorically.
ولا يسعنا هنا إلا أن نشير إلى ما تناوله
We
بعض
must refer
الساسة
here
هنا
to
في نفس
statements
القاعة
made by some
في دورة
politicians in
طارئة
this very
مماثلة
hall at a
متباكين على
similar
حقوق
emergency
فضية
special session,
بينما نلمس منهم
lamenting rights that might be
تفهما
lost.
بل تماشيا
While
مع
now
التهجير
we see them show
القسري
understanding for
للفلسطينيين
or even
لدول المنطقة.
acquiescence of
ولما لا
forcibly
فقد اعتادوا
displacing
تجاهل هذا
Palestinians to
الشعب
neighboring countries.
العظيم
Why not?
والتغاضي عن قضيته
They have
لعقود
used, they
والاستهتار
are used to
بحقوقه
ignoring this
وحقوق شعوب
people,
المنطقة حتى
ignoring
وصلنا
its
إلى
cause for
الحضيض
centuries, ignoring its rights and the rights
لا
of the
للتهجير
people of
القسري. هل ذلك
the region
بصعب؟
until we reach the absolute
رابعا
bottom.
لقد ألحت
No to the
القيادة
forceful
الفلسطينية
displacement. Is this
مرارا
really so
وتكرارا
hard?
على
Fourth,
توفير
the
الحماية الدولية
Palestinian
لشعبها
leadership has
الخاضع
insisted
تحت
time and
الاحتلال
again on
منذ
providing
عقود
protection, international
خاصة
protection
في
to its
ظل
people
تكرار
that is
تجاوزات
languishing
ميليشيات
under the yoke of
المستوطنين
occupation, especially in light
الإسرائيليين
of repeated
المسلحين
violations by
ولكن لا
armed
حياة في
settler
من تنادي
militias. But
ولا
these
يسعنا
calls
هنا
have fell
وأمامكم
on
جميعا
deaf ears.
إلا أن
We
نطالب
cannot
بضرورة
help but
تفعيل
call
هذه
once again
الحماية
before you all for
عسى أن
providing this
يستيقظوا
protection in the
ضمير من
hope
يتباكون
that
على حقوق
this
الإنسان
would
كل
awaken
إنسان
the
إلا
conscience
حقوق
of
الإنسان
those that are
الفلسطيني
lamenting the loss of human rights of all people except for the Palestinian peoples. To those rights, they turn their backs. Mr. President, ladies and
على عكس ما
gentlemen,
يدعيه مؤيدو قتل
the
النساء والأطفال
proponents of killing
وضرب
women and
الحصار
children,
وفرض التهجير
proponents of
وغيرهم
the siege, the forcible
وغيرهم من
displacement,
أنصار الحرب بأنها
and other
تهدف
proponents
لمكافحة
of the
الإرهاب
war,
واجتثاثه
they claim that this war aims to counter terrorism and uprooting terrorism, but the reality is that failing to take effective and immediate measures to stop this war would inevitably fuel terrorism. It would push generations of young people towards extremist ideologies. The reality is also that not stopping this war now before it's too late would push the whole region towards a devastating regional war that will affect the interests of those who are stalling in calling for its end more than the interests of other countries. The reality is also that failure to come out of this crisis with a clear vision to revive the peace process, revive a serious peace process that addressed the roots of the current crisis and that would lead to the two-state solution would be a grave mistake with long-term repercussions. Future generations will hold us accountable for our inaction and our myopia. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt, as a leading country, the leading country in consolidating peace in the Middle East, will continue its tireless efforts to ensure a ceasefire, to protect civilians, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid. It will continue to mediate, to release hostages and the captives and prisoners. It will continue to work on creating a conducive environment to revive the peace process that is the only way to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East. Considering all of the above, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon you to support the draft resolution under consideration today and to vote in favor for this resolution to achieve justice, to apply one standard, aiming only at stopping the killing, at maintaining peace and security, at protecting civilians. We hope that this position would be a nucleus to achieving peace in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, stop this absurdity, stop this war immediately, stand on the side of truth and justice, vote in favor of this resolution, save the peace. Is this really so hard? I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt and now invite the distinguished representative of New Zealand to take the floor.
President, New Zealand welcomes the convening of this General Assembly emergency special session. We regret the UN Security Council has been unable to perform its responsibility to act on behalf of all member states. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us all as members of the General Assembly to exercise our collective political responsibility under the UN Charter to address matters of international peace and security. President, even as this meeting convenes, the conflict in Israel and Palestine escalates. The humanitarian crisis worsens, and civilian lives continue to be needlessly lost. It is intolerable to see civilians, many of whom are children and infants, continue to suffer disproportionately as innocent victims of this conflict. As I said in the Security Council a few days ago, New Zealand condemns absolutely Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. We are appalled by their brutality, their targeting of civilians, and the taking of hostages. These are clear violations of international law. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We support Israel's right to defend itself in full compliance with international law, including in respect of actions taken in Gaza. Ultimately, though, no military solution will bring about a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians. The protection of civilians and delivery of humanitarian assistance is the most urgent priority. New Zealand joins calls for a humanitarian pause and humanitarian corridors to enable unhindered and sustained assistance and protection, in line with humanitarian principles, to those who desperately need it. We recognise the bravery of humanitarian workers who are working tirelessly in extraordinarily difficult circumstances to provide such needed assistance. We are deeply saddened that so many have been killed in the line of duty since the despicable events of 7 October. When New Zealand last served on the UN Security Council in 2015-2016, we championed Resolution 2286, which demands greater protection for healthcare in armed conflict, including hospitals and medical personnel. Healthcare facilities must never be used for military purposes or be the object of attack. We are deeply concerned to see hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. Their safety and security must be protected. We call for the establishment of designated safe areas that are strictly off limits as targets or for military use. We expect Israel and Hamas to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, which imposes obligations upon all parties engaged in armed conflict. The Palestinian people must not suffer for the atrocities of Hamas, even as Hamas exploits those same civilians as human shields. Israel also has an obligation under international humanitarian law, particularly the 4th Geneva Convention, to provide basic needs for civilians in Gaza, including food, water, energy and shelter, and to facilitate humanitarian aid. New Zealand urges all parties, including Israel and Egypt, to continue to facilitate access for the delivery of urgent humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. As the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator has observed, seeing more aid and supplies entering Gaza is another glimmer of hope for the millions of people in dire need of humanitarian aid. At the same time, they need more, much more. For our part, New Zealand is supporting humanitarian appeals for populations in Gaza, the West Bank and Israel. We stand ready to increase our support in the coming weeks. This is not a time for political posturing or for using this conflict to advance any cause except bringing peace and security to Israel, Gaza, and the wider region. It is a time for de-escalation. Finally, New Zealand remains committed to a two-state solution which envisions an independent state of Palestine, living in peace and security alongside the State of Israel. A new political horizon is essential. We call on the international community to take urgent action to advance the Middle East peace process. Without it, the armed conflict may eventually cease, but there will be no winners. We will never be free from the violence, the loss of innocent lives, the anti-Semitism, the Islamophobia that has erupted in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and around the world since 7 October. As the Secretary-General has said, we cannot lose sight of the only realistic foundation for a true peace and stability, a two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, distinguished delegates, it is my honor to address this meeting in the name of a country, Cambodia, that not so long ago was consumed by decades of war. The killing fields where those labeled the oppressed and the oppressor were devoured by the intense flame of hatred, vengeance, and extremism that fed the most heinous crimes against humanity. My delegation mourns the loss of so many innocent human lives, including one Cambodian since October 7 until now, and also earlier, both in the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. The Palestine-Israel conflict is very complex and delicate issue. Therefore, Cambodia wishes to make its own principled position in this regard instead of joining the statement made by any group. Cambodia condemns all acts of terrorism and violence against innocent civilians, regardless of their race, culture, or religion. We are deeply concerned by the escalation